Now, more specifically about Andrew, some of you will have seen his article in the December issue of Paradigm Explorer, and that's the same issue in which I also reviewed his book, which is here. And if you haven't read it, you'll certainly be wanting to read it after this presentation. It's called Gaia, Psyche and Deep Ecology, Navigating Climate Change in the Anthropocene. And it's a remarkable book in its scope and depth, because Andrew comes at the subject from quite a number of different angles, and the title tells you that. There's Gaia theory, then the psyche in terms of Jungian psychology, because he has a Jungian practice in Zurich and Bern, and his doctorate is in applied physics, and he spent many years working in renewable and sustainable energy, and so he has a remarkable range of expertise. And we met last year, almost exactly this time last year, in Interlaken, where the major Science of Consciousness, Tucson, University of Arizona Science of Consciousness conference was happening. And we had lunch together and had a chat. And so in a sense, that's why we come to be here together this morning. He's going to speak about COVID-19, climate chaos, and the need for metanoia. Metanoia is what is sometimes translated in traditional Christianity as repentance, but it actually means, I'm sure Andrew's going to explain all this, a change of mind, and indeed not only change of mind, but getting beyond the mind. Meta is beyond, and the nous is the higher mind. So with all that short background introduction, Andrew, it's a great pleasure to have you here with us in inverted commas, here virtually at any rate. He's in Switzerland, unfortunately without the mountain background from the clip, which some of you may have seen. But it's very good to have you here, Andrew, and I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you very much, David. It's a great pity not to be at Horsley, because I was going to do an experiential hour or so out in the grounds and garden and in nature, and we're all rather cut off from that with this medium. But anyhow, let's go straight into the presentation and hope the technology works. Is that good for you all?
It hasn't loaded yet.
Oh, really?
Share screen.
Yes. Oh,
I did that. I did share screen. I got a double.
Here we go.
No.
Looking good.
Just a minute. No.
That's it.
Business?
Yes,
Brilliant.
that's it. Full screen. Looking good.
Yeah. Okay. We tried that several times and it went flawlessly, but this always happens in lectures. So, before I get started, I want to just tell you that there's going to be quite a bit of text on slides. That's partly because historically I've lectured to a lot of people for whom English isn't their first language, and that's helpful. But more to the point, I'm going to make a PDF handout of the whole lecture available afterwards of all these slides, so there's no need to frantically take notes. All the references are attributed, so you can look them up for yourselves to put them into context. Let's cut to the chase. How can we reconcile this? Ours is the first generation to properly understand the damage we've been doing to our planetary household, and probably the last generation with a chance to do something transformative about it. How do we reconcile that with this? The Green Movement, which seemed to be carrying all before it in the early 1990s, has plunged into full-on midlife crisis. Unable to significantly change either the system or the behaviour of the public, assailed by a rising movement of skeptics and by public boredom with being hectored about carbon and consumption, colonised by a new breed of corporate spivs for whom sustainability is just another opportunity for selling things, the Greens are seeing a nasty realisation dawn. Despite all their work, their passion, their commitment, and the fact that most of what they've been saying has been broadly right, they are losing. There is no likelihood of the world going their way. In most Green circles, sooner or later, the conversation comes round to the same question. What the hell do we do next? This really indicates the ground I'm going to try to cover in this lecture. I've called it joining up the thinking. Civil servants, at least in the UK, like to talk about joined up thinking. I sometimes think our politicians aren't even capable of joined up writing. My background covers a lot of these, but I've also had to find out quite a lot about them along the way. ESS, I should explain, is Earth Systems Science, but I'll go through these in sequence, hopefully in enough detail for people unfamiliar with each area to keep up, but it's going to be fairly rudimentary. The Anthropocene, for people unfamiliar with the term, is the proposed geological epoch dating from the commencement of significant human impact on Earth's geology and ecosystems, including but not limited to anthropogenic climate change. I'm going to talk about we and us in this lecture a lot. Who do I mean by that? I think it's really important to specify that from the outset. Basically, what I mean is the richest 10% of people in this diagram. We are without doubt among them, and we are responsible for just about half of global CO2 emissions. I'll come back to that slide later. When did the Anthropocene begin? There's no absolute agreement on that. But I think this is a very interesting set of graphs produced by Earth System scientists who called it the Great Acceleration in homage to Polanyi's The Great Turning. This is really the immense acceleration in just about all aspects of human activity. This is socio-economic, this is from an Earth Systems perspective, all post-Second World War. Climate change is a term, of course, invented by the fossil fuel industry as a rather neutral term. I prefer the term global heating, which more accurately describes it. It's hard to get our head around. Here's a statistic from a peer-reviewed scientific paper. Human activity is adding heat to the atmosphere and oceans at a rate equivalent to 4 Hiroshima atomic bombs every second. I checked the maths, it's right. Since 1970, our climate has already absorbed more than 4 billion such bombs in accumulated energy from the sun due to greenhouse gases, and continues to do so. I'm not going to convince anybody of the reality of global heating. This is a wonderful visualization of what has happened since 1900. What you have here in the inner circle of the diagram is the regions of the world, clockwise from 12 o'clock, Africa, Asia, Europe, America, Oceania. And within those regions, you have individual countries. And what this is going to show when I run it is the anomalies relative to the long-term mean from 1951 to 1980. The sixth mass extinction. Our global society has started to destroy species of other organisms at an accelerating rate, initiating a mass extinction episode unparalleled for 65 million years. One example I read about that I think we all experience, at least those of us of my age, is that when we were younger, driving at night, we used to get insects splattered on our windscreen when sometimes the wipers wouldn't work and we would have to get out and wipe the windscreen with a cloth and a bucket of water. We just don't get that anymore. It's just one example, but this is a very, very disturbing trend. I'm going to try to introduce analytical psychology, which is the subject of more than one lecture in its own right. This all springs from the Swiss psychiatrist and polymath Carl Gustav Jung. I very much like this portrait of him by Karsh, the famous photographer. It really conveys his inward gaze, and Jung gave great emphasis to the inner life, to the life of psyche, as well as the life of matter. The best summary of it, of what's unique about analytical psychology, is probably given by Roderick Mayne at the start of his book. It presents a set of ideas that in many respects is at variance with the embedded assumptions of mainstream modern culture in the West. With its concepts of the collective unconscious, universal archetypes, the teleological process of individuation, teleological means purposive, the transpersonal self, and the epistemological priority of psychic over physical reality, Jung's model champions notions that are not easily squared with the materialistic, reductive, naturalistic, and causal emphases of modern Western culture. The variance is unfortunate, for Jung himself, later Jungians, and others interested in analytical psychological ideas have wished to make a positive and acceptable contributions to mainstream Western culture. I'm not going to talk about clinical analytical psychology at all, but let's start with Jung's developmental theory, and there are much more sophisticated ones, but this was the first cradle to grave, if you like, developmental theory proposed by anyone. And Jung used as an analogy for our development through life the passage of the sun, by which he meant the ego, across the sky. So the baseline is what Jung would call the totality of the psyche or the self. And the first half of development up to the midlife transition is really adaptation to the outer world. And the second half, the emphasis shifts gradually to adaptation to the inner world. I don't want to imply it's as mechanistic as a sudden flip. It isn't. But it is very much a shift of emphasis. And what happens at midlife, which is really what I'm going to concentrate on, is a phenomenon, enantiodromia. Jung acknowledged the origin of his term in the philosophy of Heraclitus as the play of opposites in the course of events, the view that everything that exists turns into its opposite. It is, of course, pivotal in the philosophy of the I Ching, Taoism, and so on. So what happens at midlife? The significance of the morning undoubtedly lies in the development of the individual, our entrenchment in the outer world, the propagation of our kind. But shall the earning of money, the extension of conquests, and the expansion of life go steadily on beyond the bounds of all reason and sense? Whoever carries over into the afternoon the law of the morning or the natural aim must pay for it with damage to his soul. I should add that the bold text for emphasis is mine in all these quotations. Samuels and Co. in the Critical Dictionary of Jungian Analysis wrote about this. There is one way in which Jung's first or second half dichotomy can be of enormous help, looking at the culture we live in now, which has a cast of a first half of life type. We value independence and success. It seems we cannot control our destructiveness. The qualities of the second half of life represent what our culture desperately needs to grow towards. Now, I only encountered this after I had applied the stages of life to the collective in my 2009 diploma thesis, out of which my book eventually emerged. I'd drawn on other disciplines to justify upscaling, if you like, from individual to collective psychology. Upscaling is intrinsic to the Hermetic worldview, and that's what originally attracted me to Jung. So, for example, in Hermetic aphorisms such as above, so below, and the microcosm is the macrocosm. Another, which I was already familiar with, is fractal theory. Shantana Sabadini, who should be well known, I think, to people in the Scientific and Medical Network, wrote in his introduction to the I Ching, life itself arises at the boundary between order and chaos. It requires both. It is a daughter of both. On the side of perfect order, there is only dead stability, inertia, symmetry, thermodynamic equilibrium. Nothing very interesting can happen there. Everything is too predictable. It resembles death more than life. But the side of total disorder is not very interesting either. Forms appear and disappear too quickly. There is a total lack of symmetry. Everything is too unpredictable. It is on the edge between order and chaos that the subtle dance of life takes place. And that's what we see here in the Mandelbrot set. This is the boundary between order and chaos, the number of iterations required to proceed from order to chaos. So it's unsurprising that life itself has a fractal quality, exhibiting, for example, quasi-self-similarity across scale in time through the life cycles of the cells, of our bodies, of individual humans, of human civilizations, and probably of the human species. Or self-similarity in space. Have a look at the classic short film Powers of 10. You can see it on the internet, on YouTube. So, looking at the first half of life from a collective perspective, let's not beat ourselves up too much. The first half of life has been an incredible achievement by Homo sapiens, a rather weak, hairless ape. What we've done is absolutely extraordinary and should be celebrated. I'm not decrying what we've done to this point, but I think, as Fritjof Capra said, and I haven't put it in here, the notion that if something is good, more of it automatically makes it better is completely false. And realizing that is false is the essence of ecological thinking. So if we now scale up that stages of life diagram to the collective, as I've done here, I've made the baseline Gaia, and the arc is human progress as such. And what I've done is basically I'm asserting we are having a midlife crisis. Now, there are other ways of understanding this through Jungian psychology. My colleague Jeffrey Keel talks about dissociation. I think all roads lead to Rome at the end of the day. I've identified 3 modes of denial that we're stuck in at the moment, and we are stuck in denial. We've been having conferences and we know what to do, we understand the science, but we're not doing it. So why are we stuck? Well, I identified 3 principal vectors, if you like, for this. Inertia. Well, that's an easy one, isn't it? Business as usual suits those in power, and they're doing everything they possibly can to retain it. You don't have to do or change anything. It's being somewhat challenged by COVID, as we shall see. Nostalgia. Well, just 2 examples. The great Brexit slogan, take back control, or the great Trump slogan, make America great again. These are appealing to nostalgia for a golden age, perhaps the British Empire, and when America was the world leader respectively. They are increasingly detached from reality. Hubris. Well, there's a school of thought called eco-modernism. I'll explain it in the next slide, which, for example, you can put under that umbrella notions such as geoengineering and transhumanism, Ray Kurzweil and the singularity, merging humans with silicon. God help us, I hope it doesn't ever happen. This is what Clive Hamilton has to say about it. For the eco-modernists, instead of final proof of the dangers of hubris, the new epoch is greeted as a sign of humankind's ability to renovate and control nature. In this eco-Promethean view, the Anthropocene is not evidence of human short-sightedness or foolishness, nor of global capitalism's rapaciousness, but presents an opportunity for humans finally to come into their own. Several years ago, they began to speak of the good Anthropocene. There are no planetary boundaries that limit continued growth in human populations and economic advance because human systems can adapt and indeed prosper in a warming world. What frightens me about eco-modernism is it could be attractive to governments who are bereft of any new ideas apart from worshipping economic growth. It's strange who champions it. One of the people is Stuart Brand, who used to be something of a hero to me in my hippie youth, but there you go, we all change. So, Jung put everything in a nutshell, this midlife transition. The world today hangs by a thin thread, and that thread is the psyche of man. That really brings it home to us, our responsibility. It's no use looking around at external factors. Okay, climate change is a result of engineering, of technology, and so on. That is the result of the human psyche. Things like technology are merely tools. They're neutral. It's what is done with them that is down to the human psyche. Let's look at COVID briefly. Comparing the responses to that and climate change. For the climate community, observing US national political leaders' responses to the coronavirus pandemic has been like watching the climate crisis unfold on fast forward. Many, particularly on the political right, have progressed through the same 5 stages of science denial in the face of both threats. Here we are. I'm not going to read out the contents of these boxes. You can read them in the PDF handout, but the stages are: it's not happening, it's not our fault, it's not that bad, solutions are too costly, and it's too late. Perhaps some of you have seen this meme before. It is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. I think that COVID-19 has really shaken things up, really shown that everything we take for granted is a house of cards. It's a lot more fragile. I would say it's a lot easier to imagine both the end of the world and the end of capitalism. I've talked a lot about turning points. I think what COVID has done really has accentuated a turning point into a knife edge. As many, many observers have noted, we're at a point of bifurcation in the here and now. One of the best books I've ever read, taking a long-term perspective, is William Offall's Immoderate Greatness. This is from the back cover. I think it's seminal. Because our own civilization is global, its collapse will also be global, as well as uniquely devastating, owing to the immensity of its population, complexity, and consumption. To avoid the common fate of all past civilizations will require a radical change in our ethos, to wit, the deliberate renunciation of greatness, lest we precipitate a dark age in which the arts and adornments of civilization are partially or completely lost. So what he's talking about is ending hubris. All previous civilizations have failed. Why do we think ours is any different? So, just to put a wrapper on this rather gloomy section, this is a wonderful statue that was put outside a building on the railway line I travel on in Switzerland, and I couldn't resist photographing it and putting this caption on. So, going back to that diagram where I highlighted nostalgia, inertia, and hubris, there is a fourth way, what I call self-realization and reconciliation with nature. So, we had to separate from nature. This is the hero's journey, separating from the Great Mother. We had to do that, but we've reached the point where that separation has reached its zenith, if you like, and what we've got to do is to reconcile ourselves with nature, to give up all idea of mastery, for example, of dominion. That's the fourth way, and that's what I largely want to talk about from here on in. Systems dynamics in one slide. This is nonlinear systems which have feedback from the output to the input. People talk about positive and negative feedback. I don't like those terms because they sound a bit judgmental. I prefer the terms reinforcing feedback and balancing feedback. Here are examples of each. Balancing feedback, thermostat. I say air conditioning as an example of reinforcing feedback because global electricity demand for cooling now exceeds that for heating. And so as that continues to increase, as temperatures rise, that will cause temperatures to rise further because of the greenhouse gas emissions generated in producing the electricity to drive the air conditioning. It's all you need to know at this stage, but it is the bedrock of Earth system science, and Earth system science models all sorts of complex couplings between climate, carbon cycle, water cycle, and so on. James Lovelock. He'll be 101 years old, hopefully, on the 26th of July this year. I've no evidence that he's aware of or would be particularly receptive to Jung's theories of psyche. Conversely, Jung had died 4 years before Lovelock's initial insight in 1965 while working at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California. Like Jung, he was obliged to become a great synthesist, a transgressor of conventional academic boundaries. What I find intriguing is it was when Lovelock adopted an outside standpoint that he had his epiphany. Although he was, of course, physically earthbound, he'd previously been engaged to develop systems for detecting life on other planets. Although Jung often noted the problem of psyche comprehending itself, his deeper theories were prefaced by years of psychiatric and psychoanalytical practice and immersion in radically different cultures, which offered as outside a standpoint as possible. Gaia theory in a nutshell. A view of the Earth introduced in the 1980s that sees it as a self-regulating system, emphasis, made up from the totality of organisms, the surface rocks, the ocean and the atmosphere, tightly coupled as an evolving system. The theory sees this system as having a goal, the regulation of surface conditions so as always to be as favourable as possible for contemporary life. It is based on observations and theoretical models. It is fruitful and has made 8 successful predictions. That's Lovelock's current published definition of Gaia theory, as far as I know. His systems thinking, as I said, was instrumental in the development of Earth systems science, but his assertion that the system has a goal sets it apart, and it alienated many scientists who can only accept causality. But compare it with this review of Jung's lifespan psychology. Instead of focusing on the achievement of ego competencies, Jung evaluated lives in terms of their balance, well-roundedness, wholeness. He emphasized developing the underdeveloped aspects of the self and maintaining an ongoing dialogue between the ego and non-ego aspects of the self as a total self-regulating, developing system. So Lovelock's Gaia theory relativizes humans, if you like. Jung's lifespan psychology relativizes ego. This will play a role a bit later on. And both emphasize self-regulation. What's been going on during the pandemic? Well, this was a chart recently produced showing how global daily fossil CO2 emissions suddenly plummeted as lockdown spread from one country to another. That's dramatically shown in the graph on the left. The graph on the right is simply an expanded view of what has happened since the beginning of the pandemic this year. This prompted me to ask some colleagues a dangerous question. I'm repeatedly asking myself whether the emergence and impact of COVID-19 could be understood within the framework of Gaia theory. Even asking this is dangerously open to misinterpretation, so I should clarify from the outset that the question is framed in terms of an intelligent system response, that is, balancing feedback to mitigate anthropogenic impacts. It is therefore not moral, nor a judgment or punishment, all of which were tagged onto the HIV epidemic by religious bigots. Nor do I feel any less compassion for those suffering and dying from the virus. Even so, to ask the question publicly will be castigated as misanthropy. So I'm putting a lot of trust in you. From a Gaian perspective, I doubt whether the resultant reduction in human population is going to make a significant difference, but who knows next winter. Although past pandemics such as bubonic plague have. Emphasis, I am more intrigued by our immediate responses, less industrial output, less travel, airline collapse, etc. All of which are what Gaia needs, but environmentalists have failed to achieve over decades. Perhaps this time round is a proverbial warning shot across our bow, from which we might, though I'm not hopeful, learn that we can live more frugally. This is a reply from Stefan Harding, who some of you may know. He's been an associate of James Lovelock for decades. He runs the holistic science program at Schumacher College. I do see the virus as a Gaian response, but one that is automatic and without malice or ill intent on the part of the planet. It's a simple fact that diseases can spread very fast in ecological communities that are overconnected, as is now the case in our human social sphere. Natural selection will diminish overconnected ecological communities in this way, and will tend to tune these communities to an optimal level of connectedness in which there are many weak and few strong relationships, almost certainly following a power law distribution. The lesson for humans is to make our social and economic connections much more locally self-sufficient, with far less dependency on international travel and manufacturing. It's quite clear that the virus is leading to a major slowdown in our lust for more and more growth, giving us a chance to reflect on our lifestyles and to steer them in more pro-Gaian directions. Will this happen? I doubt it. I've heard no such discussion in the British media. I'm sure that we'll be back to business as usual once we've accommodated ourselves to the new virus if it fizzles out, or with vaccines. I asked a Jungian colleague the same question, Geoffrey Keel. He's not only a Jungian analyst, he's a distinguished climate scientist with over 100 papers published over a 3-decade career. Jung himself spoke of the threats of overpopulation and that Earth would tolerate so much and then would react. He even gave the example of diseases as a way nature would deal with overpopulation. His prescience always astounds. Today in the New York Times, there is an article asking if COVID-19 is the revenge of the pangolin, who are being hunted to extinction for their body parts. I feel we must be open to asking the question you posed. From my perspective, COVID-19 may very well be nature's way of dealing with our relentless assault on her. I say this recognizing the terrible suffering and loss that this disease is spreading around the world. I do not derive any sense of justice if this is the case. It is tragic. Not surprisingly, here in the US, the first concern was how this would affect the stock market. Only after days of shock at the drop of the stock market did the focus shift to the cost on human life. Of course, we have the added disadvantage in the US that the president continues to distort and deny the reality of what is happening. I'm not going to read this out to you, just the headline at the bottom. Trump cabinet Bible teacher blames coronavirus pandemic on God's wrath. Somehow it involves China, gay people, and environmentalists. You can read it at your leisure when you get the handout. I only mention, by the way, I didn't ask these people a dangerous question, but this man, Drollinger, his Bible study meets every Wednesday morning with members of Trump's cabinet, including Mike Pompeo, Ben Carson, Betsy DeVos, and Alex Azar. Carson and Azar, notably, are members of the coronavirus task force guiding the federal government response to the pandemic. So my goodness, it's just a surreality check, if you like, to know what's going on in the minds of people supposedly at the top of the heap right now. I'm not putting much faith in our leaders. Let's go back to metaphysics from politics, for heaven's sake. And go back right to two different worldviews that emerged around the turn of the 16th century. Interesting to me is Baruch Spinoza. He was inspired by Descartes. His notion of substance meaning stand beneath, Deus sive in natura, is a being of infinitely many attributes, of which thought and extension are two. His account of the nature of reality then seems to treat the physical and mental worlds as intertwined, causally related, and deriving from the same substance. But crucially, what he did, he laid the foundations for a whole school of philosophy called dual aspect monism. One can debate whether it's philosophy or metaphysics. I'm not a professional in either. But I had encountered David Bohm's thinking long, actually, before I encountered Jungian psychology. This is David Bohm's variant of dual aspect monism. Now, David Bohm has been rather marginalized historically. There's a fantastic documentary about him that you ought to watch online on YouTube, free of charge. It's just been released, and it's called Infinite Potential. If you go to the Parry Center website, you can also register, watch a director's cut of it, also free of charge, that will be broadcast next Saturday evening. Robert Oppenheimer famously said of Bohm, if we can't disprove him, then we must all agree to ignore him. But there is a revival of interest in his ideas. This goes back to interpretation of quantum physics, the measurement problem, which over a century later is still unclear. So in place of Spinoza's substance, we have what Bohm calls the hollow movement. So the emphasis, and we have these, I should explain that above the horizontal halfway line, that is the epistemic domain. That is the world that we can experience, and below that horizontal line is the world, the reality that underpins the world that we can experience. So the emphasis in his approach is on process and gradation. That's why I've shaded this diagram somewhat to convey the rather dynamic nature of this. So the mental and the material in Bohm's model are unfolded explications of an n-folded implicate order with many subtle levels. These levels are increasingly holistic, and they're not static but dynamic. Hence, Bohm coined the term hollow movement to describe them. In his own words, because the implicate order is not static but basically dynamic in nature, in a constant process of change and development, I called its most general form the hollow movement. All things found in the unfolded explicate order emerge from the hollow movement in which they are enfolded as potentialities, and ultimately they fall back into it. The general implicate process of ordering is common both in mind and matter. This means that ultimately mind and matter are at least closely analogous and not nearly so different as they appear on superficial examination. Here's Jung on mind and matter, really arising from his conversation with Pauli, which we'll come on to. Since psyche and matter are contained in one and the same world, and moreover are in continuous contact with one another, and ultimately rest on irrepresentable transcendental factors, it is not only possible, but fairly probable even, that psyche and matter are two different aspects of one and the same thing. So Jung and Pauli collaborated for many years. Wolfgang Pauli, the physicist who gave us the exclusion principle, for which got the Nobel Prize, much more mainstream in his interpretation of quantum theory. In this, again, the structure is similar to both Spinoza diagram and the Bohm diagram. The mental and the material are epistemic manifestations of an ontic, psychophysically neutral, holistic reality called the unus mundus. This comes from Jung, and this is a term that has its roots much earlier on. It just means one world in Hermetic thinking, alchemy, and so on, whose symmetry must be broken to yield dual complementary aspects. From the mental, the unus mundus is approached via the collective unconscious, while from the material, it is approached via quantum non-locality. You must be getting exhausted. I am. We're nearly at time to have a break, so I will just dip into thinking of non-local mind, which really perhaps has always been intrinsic to Eastern thought, but in Western thought, its roots, at least recently or relatively recently, can be traced to two great thinkers, Frederick Myers and William James. I'm astonished at how many times William James still crops up as influencing thinkers to this day. For me, the gold standard publications about non-local mind are these two, Irreducible Mind and Beyond Physicalism. They both came out of the Esalen Centre for Theory and Research, the so-called SURSEM project or Survival Seminar project, that engaged 50 participants over 15 years from the physical, biological and social sciences, scholars of religion, philosophers, historians of science, neuroscientists, psychiatrists, and so on. Just to give you an idea, Irreducible Mind is a compilation of evidence for, I suppose, what might be generally called parapsychological phenomena. It covers aspects, well, going from the chapter heading, psychophysiological influence, memory, automatism and secondary centers of consciousness, unusual experiences near death and related phenomena, genius and mystical experience. I hope, I'm not an expert in any of these fields, but I hope my training as a scientist has given me a healthy dose of skepticism. And I have to say, it is an incredibly well-researched, convincing account in all these fields. Regarding Beyond Physicalism, so Irreducible Mind is really a compilation of evidence. Beyond Physicalism is saying, where do we go from here? Roderick Mayne reviewed it and he concluded the theoretical convergence towards a panentheistic metaphysics is probably the most significant finding of the book and of the SURSEM project as a whole. In panentheistic metaphysics, God permeates and gives structure and meaning to the world, including to humans, who therefore have an inborn capacity for obtaining direct, experiential, soteriological knowledge of the divine. A more recent publication by Stephen Taylor if you're not prepared to read those two Esselin books, and frankly, they are both doorstop size, this is an excellent distillation of that work that takes it further in some respects. Stephen writes, our normal experience is to feel that we are an I that lives inside our own mental space, with a boundary between us and the external world. As separate entities, we feel incomplete, fragments broken off from the whole. And by accumulating wealth or power, we're trying to bolster ourselves, to make ourselves feel stronger and more significant in order to compensate for our sense of lack. I should have said right at the beginning with the joined up thinking slide that all of the disciplines, all of the worldviews that I'm trying to connect today are in themselves essentially holistic. I think that's a point not to be overlooked. So let's move to the intermission, and these are the practical questions which I posed and which you've hopefully got a handout of. They're adapted from Bruno Latour's recent commentary on what's going on and how can we respond to the opportunities given in the crisis, if you like, that the coronavirus has precipitated. So I'll just take a breather at that point. I think, yes, let's take a breather there. Andrew, can you press the necessary buttons for that to happen?
Sure. So what we're going to do, everyone now, is put everyone into breakout groups of about sort of 4 or 5 people per group. And if you can just take note of those questions that are on your screen, and we'll ask you just to discuss those 3 questions. Andrew, I don't know if you want to make any comments about how you want people to frame the questions, or I know you sent through a comment to include with the breakout question slide. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that before we go into breakout groups now.
Well, it is really focusing on this moment of bifurcation we're at, I think, given the consequences of the pandemic. And there just seems to be a complete cognitive dissonance, if you like, between an ecological perspective on it and an economic perspective on it. And in a way, the point of this whole lecture is to provide a framework which would push us in the direction of emerging this, taking the right path rather than the wrong path. So that's what those questions are aimed at. So suspended means entirely in the context of lockdown.
Fantastic, thank you. So I'm going to put everyone into breakout rooms now, of about 5 or 6 people per room. So that should give everyone a chance to have a chat, and we'll do that for the next 15 minutes. So it's about 3 minutes to 11 right now. So I'll bring everyone back into the main meeting in about 15 minutes at about 11:15 or just before. And after that, we'll take a 5-minute break. So you'll start to see this come up on your screen, asking you to accept to go into a breakout room now. So just click yes or just click accept, and you'll start to be taken into your breakout rooms. And if you don't want to go into a breakout room for any reason, that's absolutely fine. Just don't accept the window that's popping up on your screen now. Andrew, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. And I hope we're still screen sharing. Everybody's still seeing the slide. I expect there's probably a fair degree of consensus about the first 2 of these questions. The third one is, I think, more challenging. And I think there are different levels of approaching that. And I just want to come to a more practical level, if I can. Andrew, I can't change my PowerPoint slide. Why is that?
Can you, is it, are you clicking on the forward arrows?
Okay.
Oh, here we go, you got it.
Ghost in the machine. This is really looking at the problem from all different levels. Colin Tudge very kindly made this available to me at short notice. And he wrote about it. This summarises the curriculum of our new College for Real Farming and Food Culture, which begins with the premises that to put the world to rights, we have to rethink everything that we do and take for granted from first principles. However, nothing can be put to rights ad hoc, so we have not only to rethink everything, but to rethink everything in the light of everything else. Another holistic thinker. All big ideas have metaphysical roots, but metaphysics has more or less gone missing as an independent discipline, although it still continues, albeit entwined with theology, in the world's religions. Now, I've actually worked at all three levels. The action level, for example, I used to design wind farms. The infrastructure level, I was trying to get equitable trading terms for renewable energy. But this lecture is really at the mindset level. And I just want to flag, there's plenty of science and there's plenty of metaphysics in what I'm talking about. The arts don't get a look in. I actually wanted to launch this lecture as I do when I do it live in real physical presence, with a piece of music, which I think engages us all at a soul level rather than an intellect level, which of course is the power of the arts. It was just too complicated to try and do it on Zoom. The fourth element at his mindset level, morality, it's not up to me to preach, and I just want to say, let's not sweep it under the carpet by concentrating on what we're talking about. I mentioned the one sermon that stuck in my mind from my church-going youth, which was the parable of the long spoons, which has variants in just about all cultures. They could be long chopsticks, whatever. But the whole notion is that heaven and hell are identical. They are both enormous banqueting halls with the tables just groaning under the weight of a fantastic feast, and people have long spoons manacled to their wrists. And in hell, everybody is starving, fighting, because they're trying to feed themselves. And in heaven, everybody is well fed and happy because they're feeding each other. And I just love, it's a very simple illustration of how, given the same circumstances, how we behave absolutely changes the situation. It's like Jung saying that the world hangs by a thin thread, and that is the psyche of man. And it occurred to me yesterday that a very good example of this right now is wearing face masks, and how that has polarized people in America in the present pandemic. Wearing a face mask primarily protects other people rather than you. And so there's a very strong libertarian individualist thread running through American culture, as there is in most Western cultures in comparison with the East, where face masks are almost universally worn, not just during pandemics, but whenever anybody has a cold or whatever. So I don't want to skip morality altogether, but it isn't the subject of this lecture. So what I've done so far is basically review existing material, join up the thinking as much as possible. Here we're going to move on to what comes out of it. And I'm going to do something outrageous, which is to compare psyche with Gaia. On the left is a depiction, a schematic of Jung's model of psyche. Now, the first thing to say about it is it's wrong. Every diagram of Jung's model of psyche is wrong. Why can it be reduced to a sheet of paper, in other words, 2 dimensions, when, let's say, M theory for cosmology requires at least 11 dimensions? But given those limitations, I chose it because it's round like the world, and because it mentions some of the key aspects or components, if you like, of Jung's model of psyche. Just to run through them very quickly. Ego, we're all familiar with it. It's what gives us a sense of identity and continuity. Persona comes from the Greek word for theatrical mask, and that is what we show to the outside world. So it mediates between the outside world and us. The inner world at the bottom, what mediates between us and the inner world is the animus or the animal, which, if you like, you can call it the personification of soul. And if you work with dreams, you can be pretty clear when that appears in somebody. Shadow is really what is rejected by the ego. And that ludicrous example I just gave from the man who leads Trump's cabinet's Bible study group is a classic example of shadow projection. What we tend to do, because we reject it in ourselves, we tend to see it in others. So guess what? Blaming COVID-19 on, what was it, gays and environmental activists and the Chinese. This is classic shadow projection. It's the root of almost all conflict, actually. The biggie in the middle, the self, is the hardest to define of all. Because Jung had so many definitions of the self, he devoted an entire volume of the collected works called Ion to studying the phenomenology of the self, and it's based on some very esoteric Gnostic writings in particular. I'm not familiar with the source material, just with Jung's writing, and it is extremely difficult. But the important thing about the self is that it is the greater being. It is the anthropos. It is the divinity within us. It is the totality and circumference of the psyche. He draws it here with 4 different levels, from the spiritual to the instinctual to the biological to the elemental at the bottom. It's interesting that it incorporates the polarities of mind and matter. You can see those about 2/3 of the way up. And I mentioned the unus mundus in the context of the Pauli-Jung conjecture, and so I had some very interesting discussions with a couple of Jungian colleagues, Murray Stein and Warren Coleman, who both agreed that ultimately the self in the psychoid aspect, which is Jung's term for what transcends mind and matter, it is coterminous with the unus mundus. So, psyche and Gaia. Are they different maps of the same territory? I've, ever since I think David Peat put me on to Korzybski, I've carried this like a mantra throughout my thinking. A map is not the territory it represents, but if correct, it has a similar structure to the territory, which accounts for its usefulness. So, the classic example, René Magritte's Ceci n'est pas une pipe. Of course it's not. It's a painting of a pipe. It's a map of a pipe. It's not a pipe per se. So, what I'm contending is if mind and matter are complementary aspects of the unus mundus, as in the Pauli-Jung conjecture, then Jung and Lovelock were drawing different maps of ultimately the same territory, like political or mental and physical material maps of the worlds we inhabit. If so, a degree of correlation between their maps is only to be expected. So what I've done is I've limited the generic mental and material domains from the Pauli-Jung conjecture to the human domains, our inner mental world, psyche, and our outer material world, Gaia. And I should say right now, Gaia includes physical human presence and activity. We are part of Gaia, we're not separate from it. So, this is my conjecture, given those 2 subsets. We have ontic and epistemic domains and graded boundaries shown by the shading as before. The dotted line between psyche and Gaia indicates a degree of efficient causality. In other words, direct, not via the unus mundus. For example, Gaia determined evolution of psyche. We adapted to our environment, and psyche is causing the Anthropocene. The language of archetypal ordering in psyche is primarily symbolic. In Gaia, primarily chemical, There's a lot of talk in Earth system science, for example, about biogeochemistry, and in both instinctual. This is very much Anthony Stevens, another Jungian analyst's approach. The dynamic of archetypal ordering can be understood as emergent phenomena, which in psyche includes complexes. My colleague Nancy Krieger has written about this, based on a lot of neuroscience thinking, and in Gaia, climate, atmosphere, ecosystems, and so on. These are all emergent phenomena. Now, what's the evidence for my conjecture? Well, I did some correlations. I think I've already stressed the concept of self-regulation in both Jung's model of psyche and Lovelock's model of Gaia. And that was really what set me thinking about this in the first place. So just working down the levels of this table. In the psyche, for self-regulation in the psyche, that is through a process called compensation. It is not simply opposition, but the compensatory function, for example, appears in dreams, which is why we work so much with dreams. The first question a Jungian will ask, given a dream, is what imbalance in the dreamer's conscious attitude does this dream compensate? And as I say, it's not simple opposition. It could be exaggeration. It could be ridicule. It could be making it very frightening. There are many ways in which psyche compensates. Jungian psychology is basically fairly optimistic in the sense of psychic self-regulation. It's worth adding. In Gaia, as in Earth system science, biogeochemical feedback. So self-regulation, well, the function of the ego, as I said, the role of the ego is to enable us to function in the present. Without it, I couldn't give this lecture. And in Gaia, it is to favour contemporary life. At the same time, there's a self-realization process going on. Now, there's a sort of archetypal tension in both systems between stability and growth. So the process of self-realization in the psyche is what we call individuation, which is a characteristic of the second half of life. I'll have more to say about it. And in Gaia is evolution. And the goal of self-realization is wholeness in Jung's model of psyche and biodiversity in Gaia theory. And this tension between stability and growth can be viewed from a systems perspective because the goal of self-realization is commensurate with increased resilience. And resilience means adaptability of a system to changing circumstances. We can correlate the structures and contents of psyche and Gaia, and I've done so here. And I'll work through each of these levels in turn. The ego, the individual center of consciousness, I'm equating with us, Homo sapiens, as the planetary center of consciousness. Shadow, which I've already explained, is all that is rejected and denied by the ego. I equate with anthropogenic impacts, because without ego, without humanity, there would be no such impacts. They are an inevitable, just as shadow is an inevitable consequence of having an ego, anthropogenic impacts are an inevitable consequence of human activity. Anima, animus, the individual human soul, if you like, has its correlate in the anima mundi, the world soul. So let's look at each of these levels briefly in turn. This quote from Lovelock really made me think about ego and Homo sapiens, if you like, as the ego of the world. He was speculating, do we as a species constitute a Gaian nervous system and a brain which can consciously anticipate environmental changes? Still more important is the implication that the evolution of Homo sapiens, with his technological inventiveness and his increasingly subtle communications network, has vastly increased Gaia's range of perception. She is now, through us, awake and aware of herself. That's absolutely ego function in a nutshell. This is what Jung writes about shadow. One of the many things he writes about shadow. Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. If it is repressed and isolated from consciousness, it never gets corrected and is liable to burst forth suddenly in a moment of unawareness. At all counts, it forms an unconscious snag, thwarting our most well-meant intentions. My attribution of rejection and denial to our anthropogenic impacts, which is the basis of their correlation with shadow, needs to be substantiated a bit more. Rejection applies to all forms of pollution arising from human activity. Pollution is an unwanted but inevitable consequence of virtually all human activity, and hence a material product of human consciousness. Whether sent up factory chimneys into the air, down rivers into the sea, or buried in the ground, we try to get rid of it. Examples include greenhouse gases, microplastics, pesticides, nitrates, and toxic waste. Denial includes these impacts and almost any other form of harm to Gaia that are deliberately concealed, out of sight, out of mind, or at least conveniently ignored, lest they distract us from the production and consumption on which our way of life depends. Major candidates include mining, deforestation, soil depletion, and above all, the sixth great extinction. So the statement which Jung makes clear, the dangers of failure to acknowledge and deal with the shadow, the same can be said for anthropogenic impacts. Then the third level in that correlated structure and contents diagram, anima mundi, the world soul. Difficult thing to talk about. The soul, whether personal or global, is not in such an antipathetic relationship to consciousness, but is also routinely ignored in our culture. Beyond the gender controversy about anima, animus, Jung insisted that the personification of soul in us was contrasexual, that a man had an anima, a woman had an animus. Under current cultural conditions, it seems more reasonable than ever to describe the world's soul as the implicitly feminine anima mundi. This is because our collective consciousness and our entire civilization are so dangerously skewed towards patriarchy that an archetypally feminine counterbalance is required. William Golding's genius in suggesting Gaia as the personification of Earth in Lovelock's theory is just a good example of this. Jungian analyst Verena Kast suggests that anima and animus are archetypes of relationship and bonding, capable of, quote, bringing us closer to the individual personality, to the self, and perhaps even to images of being in relationship with something like the anima mundi. I've put these two pictures up to try and convey, in a very limited way, personal experiences of anima mundi. The watercolour on the left I bought in Cusco after hiking the long way up to Machu Picchu, and the landscape, as depicted here, incorporates the three principal animals in pre-Hispanic, in other words, Quechua and Aymara cosmology, the condor, the puma, and the serpent. And I just love the way it incorporated them into the landform of Machu Picchu. The tree on the right, my wife is Japanese, and we were hiking together in Japan, and we came upon this tree, and just around the corner from the tree was a Shinto shrine. Many of you know Shinto is very close to nature as a religion, but I always wonder whether I'm picking up on the energy of the Shinto shrine or the energy of the tree, or the Shinto shrine is picking up on the energy of the tree, or what. But again, there seem to be places where we really feel something very strongly, not intellectually, but emotionally or spiritually, if you like. That's why it's so damned hard to convey in writing. Somebody had a go a long time ago. In fact, this is where the term came from, Plato. Divine providence brought our world into being as a truly living thing endowed with soul and intelligence. That living thing of which all other living things are parts, both individually and by kinds. For that living thing comprehends within itself all intelligible living things, just as our world is made up of us and all the other visible creatures. Compare that with what launched Lovelock's fame. He wrote this in New Scientist. The system seemed to exhibit the behaviour of a single organism, even a living creature. One having such formidable powers deserved a name to match it. William Golding, the novelist, suggested Gaia, the name given by the ancient Greeks to their earth goddess. After this article appeared in New Scientist, Lovelock received invitations from 21 publishers to write a book for the general public. The result, Gaia, A New Look at Life on Earth, was first published in 1979. The foundational evidence for Gaia is the fact that the temperature of the biosphere has remained within the limits necessary for supporting life as we know it, since life itself emerged some 3.5 billion years ago, despite a 25 to 30% increase in the sun's brightness over that period. This indicates self-regulation on a planetary scale, and such behaviour, self-regulation, is a property of all living organisms. Got him into terrible trouble, of course, with mainstream science, but captured the public's imagination. We're dealing with a problem. That's the whole point of this lecture. So I've tried to correlate some pathologies here, the cause and the effect of the pathologies. So what I'm saying, in our present psychic pathology, if you like, collectively, is a monotheism of consciousness. And if you think back to that arc of the sun across the sky, or if you like, the ego, whether individually or collectively, the ego is now as far distanced from the rest of the psyche as it's ever going to be. And that is a consequence. The consequence of that is what Jung calls monotheism of consciousness. No coincidence, I posit, that it coincides with human dominance of Gaia. The effect is enantiodromia, which you've already encountered. It's going to be reversal. It's going to be the Anthropocene. Let's explore this a little bit more. This is Jung in ranting mode. Quite right too. We lack all knowledge of the unconscious psyche and pursue the cult of consciousness to the exclusion of all else. Our true religion is a monotheism of consciousness, a possession by it, coupled with a fanatical denial of the existence of fragmentary autonomous systems. This entails a great psychic danger because the autonomous systems then behave like any other repressed contents. They necessarily induce wrong attitudes, since the repressed material appears in consciousness in spurious form. The effect is collectively present all the time. There are many ways to measure human dominance, but I think I can sum it up in this graph, which shows simply that 90% of all terrestrial vertebrates are either us or are domesticated animals. Only 3% of terrestrial vertebrates are wild animals now. And that has changed dramatically in my own lifetime. So enantiodromia and the Anthropocene. I use the term enantiodromia for the emergence of the unconscious opposite in the course of time. This characteristic phenomenon practically always occurs when an extreme one-sided tendency dominates conscious life. In time, an equally powerful counterposition is built up, which first inhibits the conscious performance and subsequently breaks through the conscious control. Now, if we equate the unconscious with the other than human world, this could be taken as a succinct description of the Anthropocene. The enantiodromia is the more we try to maximize our material comfort, the more material suffering we will create. The tragedy, of course, is that the suffering is down the line, is for future generations. So, just a reminder of where we were with this. We want to go down the path, if you like, of self-realization of reconciliation with nature. I called the first half of life collectively, as a species or as a civilization, heroic development. I call the second half of life, this reconciliation with nature, frugal individuation. And I take the word frugal from William Offals again, who writes, frugality is not the same as stinginess or asceticism. To be frugal means to be sparing in the use of resources, that is, thrifty without being pinch penny. Frugality is the art of making as little as possible go as far as possible. The etymology of frugal is revealing. It comes from frugalior, which is derived from the Latin word for fruit and denotes useful or worthy. It therefore fits perfectly with the essential principle of ecological economics, usufruct, which is the use and enjoyment of property or resources without damaging or depleting their worth so that they remain permanently useful. The framework for this fourth path, this reconciliation with nature, this self-realization, is deep ecology. I like this summary of it very much. Deep ecology is radically conservative, what a splendid expression, in that it articulates a long-established minority stream of religion and philosophy in Western Europe, North America, and the Orient. It also has strong parallels and shared insights with many religious and philosophical positions of primal peoples. In a certain sense, it can be interpreted as remembering wisdom which men once knew. That's quite a humbling thought when we always think newer is better. There's a so-called 8-point platform of deep ecology. I'm not going to elaborate on all 4 points. I've more put these slides in so that you can study them when you get the PDF handouts afterwards. I do want to say that the first point, the text, well, let's read the first point out. The well-being and flourishing of human and non-human life on Earth have value in themselves. These values are independent of the usefulness of the non-human world for human purposes. This draws a line in the sand between deep ecology and what's sometimes called survival environmentalism or reform environmentalism, lifeboat environmentalism, the view of the other than human world as a service economy. We can put monetary values on everything. No, we're all part of the same game. I will get an elaboration on that later. I will just mention here the 4th point about a substantial decrease of the human population gets us into hot water. I'll tackle that one head on, if you forgive the mixed metaphor, shortly. Arnie Ness, he lived from 1912 to 2009, a Norwegian philosopher. His influences included Spinoza. He's the grandfather, really, of deep ecology, I should add. His influences included Spinoza, William James, again, Mahatma Gandhi, Erich Fromm, and Zen Buddhism, but not, as far as I know, Jung. He and Lovelock did know each other, I believe. He was especially inspired by Rachel Carson, whose Silent Spring profoundly challenged our anthropocentric assumptions. When he was interviewed in 1982, he said, "I'm not for the simple life, except in the sense of a life simple in means, but rich in goals and values. I have tremendous ambition. Only the best is good enough for me. I like richness, and I feel richer than the richest person when I'm in my cottage in the country with water I've carried from a certain well and with wood I've gathered. When you take a helicopter to the summit of a mountain, the view looks like a postcard. And if there's a restaurant on top, you might complain that the food is not properly made. But if you struggle up from the bottom, you have this deep feeling of satisfaction. And even the sandwiches mixed with ski wax and sand taste fantastic." His little cottage was actually high up in the mountains and had 6 levels of roof secured with metal hawsers to stop them from being blown off in the winter storms. Just an aside. Ness talked about self-realization, a term we've come across already. I do not use this expression in any narrow individualistic sense. I want to give it an expanded meaning based on the distinction between a large comprehensive self and a narrow egoistic self, as conceived of in certain Eastern traditions of Atman. Like Jung, he was influenced by the Upanishads here. This large comprehensive self embraces all the life forms on the planet, together with their individual selves. Viewed systematically, not individually, maximum self-realization implies maximizing the manifestations of all life. Self-realization was so important to Jung that this is the opening line of his autobiography. My life is a story of the self-realization of the unconscious. Everything in the unconscious seeks outward manifestation, and the personality too desires to evolve out of its unconscious conditions and to experience itself as a whole. We could therefore translate individuation as coming to selfhood or self-realization. Or as James Hillman wrote, there is only one core issue for all psychology. Where is the me? Where does the me begin? Where does the me stop? Where does the other begin? Arne Ness had his little hut at Tvergestein. Jung had a remote lakeside retreat with no electricity or running water on the shore of Lake Zurich. And he increasingly spent time alone there in his old age. When he was there, he once wrote, "At times I feel as if I'm spread out over the landscape and inside things, and am myself living in every tree, in the splashing of the waves, in the clouds and the animals that come and go, in the processions of the seasons." That is Jung experiencing Ness's ecological self, I contend. Cultural diversity. We've talked about wholeness in psyche and biodiversity in Gaia. I think it's very important that, this from Ness, deep cultural diversity is an analogue on the human level to the biological richness and diversity of life forms. So, both Jungian psychology and deep ecology embrace wholeness, of which the majority is other than ego in the former and other than human in the latter. In other words, deep ecology is above all biocentric, not anthropocentric. So, if I correlate the dynamics, and I say dynamics because they're really processes of deep ecology and individuation, if we go through this row by row, what changes? Well, our worldview changes, our ethos changes, our population reduces. We shift from an anthropocentric to a biocentric relationship with the world. And in the individuation process, the midpoint of the personality shifts from the ego to the self. So given my equation of ego with Homo sapiens, these two are very closely correlated. The goal, again, systems theory, resilience, biotic flourishing and cultural diversity, and psychological wholeness, respectively. And the agent of these changes is the ecological self and the Jungian self. I mean, at the end of the day, it's probably one and the same thing. Again, maps and territories. I said I'd talk about overpopulation a bit, as I do in my book. This breaking of an almost universal taboo provokes correspondingly widespread accusations of misanthropy against deep ecology. The role of human population growth on anthropogenic impacts is undeniable, yet we're trapped in a state of cognitive dissonance again. whereby a naturally decreasing population is an ecologist's dream and an economist's nightmare. One doesn't need much imagination to see that our quality of life would improve if there were less of us, with more of everything to go round and less overcrowding, thereby reducing our alienation from nature and from each other. Conversely, the consequences of endless population growth look decidedly ugly to anyone except presumably an eco-modernist. The more of us there are competing for control of finite resources, the less of those resources will remain, and the greater the risk of conflict, famine, and now pandemic. More of us will suffer directly from anthropogenic impacts, such as climate change, extreme weather events, and so on. Bluntly stated, both the absolute number and proportion of violent and agonizing human deaths, whether at the hands of another or from natural catastrophe, will inevitably increase with population. I don't see how wanting that is misanthropic. Another accusation routinely levelled against any discussion of population is that it's inherently racist. This is absolute nonsense. And the people who do it really are people who should know better, people like George Monbiot and Naomi Klein, for example. I say that and I revert to this diagram because we're not talking about violent population reduction, we're talking about choosing to have less children. And if you want more bangs for your buck in terms of people choosing to have less children, then it's us, the richest 10%, who ought to choose to have less children, not the people at the other end of this graph, which is, I don't know, this is the fantasy that people who want to see our population decline a bit. It doesn't matter the colour of somebody's skin. What matters is their environmental impact, and we want less people with high environmental impacts, or if you like, environmental footprints in this world. The rate of population increase is declining, as a lot of people like to point out, but the population is nonetheless increasing. If I visit, I don't know, I was in Florence last year, for example, and I was astounded by how crowded it was. And I think, am I simply becoming an old curmudgeon? Well, no, there are actually 3 times as many people in the world as when I was born. It's not surprising, is it? And of course, there are enormous emerging middle classes in whole regions of the world, India and China, where there weren't before, who have the resources to be tourists just like we have been. And why not? We can't deny them the right to what we've enjoyed. But just to put that into context, this is a graph that shows the efficacy of different measures to reduce individual CO2 emissions. The left-hand column is having 1 fewer child, or grammatically it should be 1 less child. And the y-axis has had to be broken because it is just so much more than all of the others put together. To an extent, it's country dependent. That's why I said high ecological footprint cultures should have less children. And if you look carefully, the top left-hand corner, the USA, the savings there are 120 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. Compare that with the next most effective measure, again for the USA, which is live car free. That is 3 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. So having 1 less child is 40 times as effective in terms of reducing individual emissions. That's why it's so important. The point of this whole paper was that the measures that governments like promoting most are the ones at the right-hand end of the graph. So, you know, recycling, hang your clothes out to dry, upgrade your light bulbs. They're the least effective. I don't want to be misunderstood here. We have so little time left. We've got to do everything simultaneously. We've got to take all of these measures simultaneously. But stop sweeping the issue of population under the carpet. Deep ecology embraces other issues that reform environmentalism doesn't, although there's an increasing concept of environmental justice or climate justice. I've mentioned patriarchy, which is our urge to control nature rather than working with nature. But the main reason I put this slide up is I like the photograph so much. For those who remember, it was the Esha Evans in Baton Rouge. Who's the stronger side there? Huh? Inequality. I think we all know about that. The bottom line, it seems to me, is that the poor can't get richer unless the rich get poorer. Although I'm ready for an economist to explain to me why that isn't the case. If some of that money was released, we could perhaps do a great deal more to combat the coming effects of the Anthropocene. I think Jeff Bezos has overtaken Bill Gates now, but frankly, who cares? We need to learn from nature. That again is, we've done a great deal of learning about nature, and out of that has come all our technology and so on, but it's time again to end the hubris, to learn from nature. This is a remarkable man who I discovered via my wife through a Japanese documentary series called Gaia Symphony. Shigeo Nozawa, he was an agronomist. And you'll see the results of what he did in the next slide. They're astounding. He said, the only thing I did was remove conditions that would be hazardous to the tree's growth. I just facilitated their fullest self-realization. There's that expression again. To provide assistance so it could reach its fullest potential. An infinite life force exists in the universe. The key to this life force is in our hearts. What this is archetypally is a matriarchal rather than a patriarchal approach to nature. It's controlling, it's nourishing, it's sustaining, it's not manipulating, it's not controlling. He succeeded in growing a giant tomato tree with leaves spreading out to form a canopy 8 meters wide and the trunk growing to 15 centimeters in diameter and bearing 17,000 tasty tomatoes without any genetic manipulation or use of special fertilizers. He died before James Lovelock visited the tomato tree in October 2003. My wife and I were privileged to do so in 2014. So I can promise you that is not photoshopped. That is the real deal. I don't know if any of you have seen this film, The Animal Communicator. This woman, Anna Breitenbach, she appears to be communicating with a variety of mammals, elephants, eland, baboons, a capuchin monkey, and a black leopard, a cockatoo, and even fish. I have to say appears to be because it's unprovable. You can watch this on YouTube. It's 52 minutes long if you watch the full version. Ever the skeptic, I checked out her bona fides with Ian Player, the great South African environmental educator, conservation and activist, who was also engaged with analytical psychology for decades with Lawrence van der Post. He wrote me back, it was very synchronistic as I sent your animal communicator to one of the field rangers in the Wilderness Leadership School, this would be a Zulu field ranger, who happened to be out in the bush with Anna Breitenbach, who he said was very impressive. I know from my own experience in one particular instance, I and a group of people on a wilderness trail were approached by a huge lioness, and the old game scout who was with us stood up and addressed the lioness, giving them their Zulu praise names and asking them to go away, which they did. They slowly turned around and walked away. I was hiking on my own in KwaZulu-Natal, 20 years ago now, through quite thick forest, and I walked into a troop of baboons, maybe 20, 30 of them. And baboons are pretty scary creatures. When you open their mouth and see their canines, you don't want to mess with them. And absolutely instinctively, I don't claim to be an animal communicator, but absolutely instinctively, I just closed my eyes and said, I apologize. I didn't know this was your place. I'm going to leave in peace. And I walked very slowly out of there backwards. And nothing happened. There was no trouble. I can't say what would have happened if I didn't do that, but it just intrigues me that instinctively I did that. I've talked a lot about science. I've only talked about Western science. Jeremy Narby went to live among the Ashaninka people in the Peruvian Amazon for a 2-year period of field work. He had no idea how they knew what use to make of which plant in the world's most diverse biome, which is estimated to contain at least 80,000 species. His job, by the way, was to show that they made rational, quote unquote, use of their biosphere so that the World Bank funded project to drive I can't remember, a highway or whatever through their land would be halted. The indigenous explanation, the Ashaninka's explanation of how they knew what use to make of plants, was that the plants themselves tell them in their visions. Narby was likewise astonished to hear these people speak of plants as their kin, as intelligent beings with personalities and intentions. Narby, who described himself as a materialist, rationalist, agnostic when he embarked on his fieldwork, was told that he would have to take ayahuasca himself to understand all this. And his book, I recommend, The Cosmic Serpent, DNA and the Origins of Knowledge, recounts his experiences. Just one slide at the infrastructure level, the much more practical level, if you like, in Colin Tudge's diagram, is a very inspiring book called Donut Economics by Kate Raworth, whose quote, actually, I opened this entire presentation with. The outer circle in this diagram is based on the planetary boundaries which have been established by Earth system scientists. I don't have time to elaborate on those. And the inner circle is based on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals agreed by 193 member countries in 2015. So what she's saying is we should not overshoot the ecological boundaries. We should not fall short of the social boundaries, and the safe and just space for humanity is within those. It isn't going anywhere in the sense of, economists are fixated with graphs and trends and so on. No, the idea is to stay in that space. Being a Jungian, we like doing picture interpretation, so I thought, this is interesting. I thought, it resembles the hand-drawn circle or the Ensor of Zen Buddhism, which is, appropriately enough, a reminder to free oneself from attachments. It is likewise reminiscent of the Ouroboros, the serpent devouring its own tail of Western esotericism, which is a symbol of introspection and eternal recreation. At the very least, it conveys the notion of a circular economy, which is an essential element in the means she proposes to get and remain in the donut. If ever there was a good example of the picture being worth 1,000 words, this is surely one, as it anchors Raworth's argument in our minds, much as the single word Gaia did for Lovelock. Our neoliberal zeitgeist is overwhelmed with corporate logos. Think of Naomi Klein's No Logo book. So we need a few competing icons to inspire a different worldview. I'm going to start wrapping up now. In science and history, consilience refers to the principle that evidence from independent, unrelated sources can converge on strong conclusions. I think I first came through it, across it through the writings of E.O. Wilson. That is, when multiple sources of evidence are in agreement, the conclusion can be very strong, even when none of the individual sources of evidence is significantly so on its own. Most established scientific knowledge is supported by a convergence of evidence. If not, the evidence is comparatively weak, and there will not likely be a strong scientific consensus. Jung writing about individuation. If one is allowed to speak of a complete individuation at all, I should say that it would be a conscious experience of the totality of nature. The provisional life is a mutilated existence. It is only half a life, giving absolutely no chance of fulfillment, which is the only guarantee for a consciousness that is in harmony with the totality of nature. Only when you behave exactly as you are meant to behave are you the friend and the brother of all living things. Then you are right in your place. And then you suddenly understand that everything else is in its place. That is the experience which old China called Tao. This extraordinary quotation relates to the Rainmaker story, which I don't have time to go into, even though Jung does not make the connection explicit here. The appearance of the totality of nature, by which it is likely that Jung meant both inner and outer nature, twice in this extraordinary statement, is remarkable. At no time does he mention power or control in our relationship with it, but experience and harmony. Likewise, when behaving exactly as one is meant to, one is the friend and brother of all living things, not their lord or master. Eco-modernists in particular, please take note. As such, Jung's concept of individuation appears to be entirely compatible with the philosophy underlying deep ecology. So some last words perhaps from the three big contributors to what I've been saying. And one reason I've quoted people so much is since I'm trying to join to establish synergies between their theories, I really want to hear them speak in their own words to show that I'm not tinkering with it. Lovelock wrote, Gaia is significant beyond science, if only to warn that to act for the good of humankind alone is not enough. The stable state of our planet includes man as a part of or partner in a very democratic entity. And I think the present pandemic has given us a humbling reminder of that. Arnie Ness. Part of the joy stems from the consciousness of something bigger than our ego, something which has endured through millions of years and is worth continued life for millions of years. The requisite care flows naturally if the self is widened, so that protection of free nature is felt and conceived as protection of ourselves. It's why deep ecology is essentially a psychological approach, not a moralistic approach. But compare that with what Jung says. The decisive question for man is he related to something infinite or not? Only if we know that the thing which truly matters is the infinite, can we avoid fixing our interest upon futilities and upon all kinds of goals which are not of real importance. It's up to us. As Jung wrote, as any change must begin somewhere, it is a single individual who will undergo it and carry it through. Nobody can afford to look round and wait for somebody else to do what he is loath to do himself. And Fritz Schumacher, who, when I read Small is Beautiful, 40 years ago, that probably kick-started my own personal metanoia. Can we rely on it that a turning around will be accomplished by enough people quickly enough to save the modern world? This question is often asked, but no matter what the answer is, it will mislead. The answer yes would lead to complacency. The answer no to despair. It is desirable to leave these perplexities behind us and get down to work. So, in conclusion, I thought I'd plug my own book, having plugged several others. I've established intriguing synergies between apparently unrelated views and models of the inner and outer worlds. But to what end? With the arguably bland term frugal individuation for the way ahead, I envisage frugality in awful sense of the art of making as little as possible go as far as possible. But let's not kid ourselves at this critical juncture. Living without the unprecedented comforts and opportunities opportunities to which we've become accustomed, will be challenging, but we have no choice. Will we have to be coerced, kicking and screaming into frugality? Or can we make the transition willingly, even joyfully? I think meaning comes into this. As a Jungian analyst, I know the transformative impact of finding meaning in its inescapable individual suffering. Collectively, one way to find meaning in our imminent material deprivation is to understand it as a voluntary act of surrender to a principle that transcends our egotistical desires. The Abrahamic faiths that underpin Western culture, with their off-world anthropomorphic God and creation myth of human domination, have little to offer in this context. Rather, I contend that each of us can, in our own way, find the necessary meaning through the process of individuation, the common ground of which, in my framework, is moving towards realization of both the Jungian and ecological self, to expand our awareness of and identification with the other than ego and other than human, respectively. It may be hard to see why we should care for an inert world, but it is surely far harder to see why we should not care for a sentient world, for another, or perhaps even ultimately the same, soul. This could quite literally make a world of difference to our fate. That's it, folks. Back to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrew. I think if we were in a room after that magisterial presentation, brilliant magisterial presentation, you would deserve a standing ovation. And so that's my standing ovation is my reaction to your initial reaction to your talk.